Don't try to sneak into your room like that. I know what you've got behind your back. Records. More new records.
James Sàez, very nice to meet you. We're here to talk about Nat King Cole live at the Blue Note in Chicago, 1953. And you're a producer, an engineer, and a composer, and much more. Why don't we just get our conversation started? Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do?
Sure. I grew up in Miami. I went to school in Boston. I went to Berkeley. It's a big music school there, and graduated and moved out to Los Angeles in the early 90s, and spent about 5 or 6 years working at the record plant, which was a huge studio here in Los Angeles on hundreds of records, everything from Nine Inch Nails to Barbra Streisand, kind of rolled through those doors. And then I went freelance toward the end of that. Worked for Bob Clearmountain for a little while, did a number of years working with Social Distortion and Mike Ness, producing records with that. Did a number of projects with Jerry Lee Lewis, which turned into a lot of recording. Yeah, I've been doing this since I was 10. It's a bit of a disease, as I'm sure I can see from the records behind you that you equally are in the support groups for.
Yep.
I started doing more television work, I guess, and film work in, I'm gonna say the beginning of, well, 2000s, middle of 2000s, when record labels kind of started to fall off and the budgets of making records the way I like to make them was more difficult. And I was very fortunate to start working with with some really kind of high level composers right away, which was just fortunate. I wasn't like kind of searching for it. It kind of found me. I wound up working with Dave Porter, who was doing Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, The Blacklist, probably 6 or 7 other television shows that I could get into. We just finished Echo for Marvel. And yeah, it's that was a whole different thing. I wound up playing a lot more guitar than recording records. But there's a huge engineering part of that, doing a lot of orchestra, doing a lot of score, recording a lot of horn sections and woodwinds, things like that. Everything from when you're doing score, you're like every day is like a, now they want us to do a Sergio, like a very involved spaghetti Western piece, or we're doing big orchestra, or we're doing something that's really industrial and sounds aggressive. So you're kind of wearing a lot of different hats. A few years ago, I started working for Iconic Artists Group as a consultant, mainly helping with their archive and working with tapes and things like that, because I was definitely very involved in the transition from kind of more analog into being more digital. At the record plant, we had the first real kind of Pro Tools system in Los Angeles. So I was in charge of kind of getting that off the ground, and when the technology wasn't so great, and kind of shepherding that kind of change over. So having knowledge about kind of older sources and seeing that come into new technology has been a big asset, especially when you're looking at artists and legacy artists of eras of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and things come in that are, there's a lot of detective work when it comes to that kind of restoration, I guess you would call it.
Right. And
Yeah.
you also own the Audio Labs studio in Los Angeles,
Yep.
which I guess is where you're joining us from today.
That is. Yeah. There's 3 or 4 rooms here. There's probably 60 or 70 guitars, way too much gear, and a lot of microphones and things like that. This is where I work on most of the score. But I work on everything. So I'm working on records nonstop. I think I produced 4 or 5 records last year, and worked on a couple television shows and a film. So it's busy, but I love it. And the commute, because it's 30 feet from my house, is really great. Which, if you live in Los Angeles, you understand the difficulties of that problem.
No
But yeah,
driving, no highways.
I'm very passionate about it. I think about it kind of nonstop. So I've worked with artists forever, and yeah, it's very important to me. Yeah, I I find music to be kind of very close to my religion, if that makes any sense.
Sure, sure it does. Of course it
Yeah.
does. And of course, as I mentioned, we're here to discuss today the new release that's coming out for Record Store Day 2024, and it's Nat
Yeah.
King Cole live at the Blue Note Chicago 1953. And it is a double album here, and I don't want to drop it while I'm showing it, but it's a very beautifully produced record, and you'll tell us a little bit about the aesthetics a little bit later. But why don't you give everybody a nutshell? Of course, I have a lot of questions to ask you about the project, but why don't you give us the elevator pitch? You know, how did you kind of get involved in this project, and what would you tell someone on the street that you were meeting for the first time about this new record that you've just produced that's just coming out this month?
Well, yeah, it's this one's honestly, this one's a really big one for me. I was a Nat King Cole fan when I was young. Kind of in your parents' house listening to these kind of his voice and this time period, these kind of amazing songwriting, like the Nelson Riddle era of this, and just his smoothness. And I don't know, I was just a huge fan. Going to jazz school, you get kind of pushed hard in these directions, and you kind of get into hardcore jazz or bebop for a while, and then you have your favorites in that group, and he was definitely one of mine. I think this is actually a really big historic record because it's kind of a picture of a time period and a setting that I think is really surprising for the artist. Nat King Cole at this point in 1953 was doing very well. He had kind of moved through his kind of trio era a bit, and was playing theaters, larger venues, and kind of transitioned into more of the stage singer, the kind of forward spotlight, vocalist that we kind of think of now. But I think there also is this band leader and this Chicago guy who was really just this virtuoso in kind of melody and holding a band together and performing in a jazz space. And that wasn't a big highlight of his career after that. He always dabbled in it, he always did it, but it wasn't what they showcased. So at this time, he was really at his height, and for him to be playing the Blue Note in Chicago, which is also really kind of important to the story because this is the first integrated club. This was kind of a revolutionary time when Chicago was, kind of cut between two different sectors of the city. And I think that this dividing line really, it speaks a lot to what Chicago has gone through. And I was fortunate, iconic. I give them great credit that they actually, we went to Chicago and I stayed there for a while, and I, went to his house where he grew up and like walked to his high school, and, you go around the neighborhood, you really get a feeling of understanding what that music and what that culture was like at that time. And for him to play this show is kind of like if a huge artist were maybe playing the Roxy in Los Angeles, which I've gone and seen. Every once in a while you get invited, like somebody like Paul McCartney's doing a small show with 100 people, and you're like, what? And you get to go and kind of see something amazing like that. I do feel like, there's a piece of that here where he's playing a small show. I feel in talking with Tom, who is Frank, who ran the Blue Note, it's his son, that there was a family connection. There was a family, dynamic between a lot of these artists, Nat included, and the Holzfind family. And I feel like he almost was doing it as a favor to come back and play this venue. So it's kind of a sneak peek into seeing him in a small trio position where he's playing a lot of piano. As a musician myself and a player, I came into this not realizing he was that competent at playing piano. And I think that was really exciting to me. Like, how close am I? 6 to 8 feet. It's not the Nelson Riddle Orchestra and he's in a suit and, it's very polite society. This was really nighttime with cocktails. It was, I think, 100 degrees in New York this week. and he was doing 3 shows a day, and it was, sometimes the crowd was mellow during the day but extremely rambunctious at night. So for all those reasons, I thought it was an amazing find. And I'm always skeptical when I hear about this. This originated on a phone call with Tom, the son of the owner of the Blue Note. And he mentioned it, and I thought, well, the tapes could be in bad condition. They could, how many things were really recorded? Was it recorded well? Obviously there's a million ways that this could be a difficult project. And when I got the tapes that were very unassuming, there was, 4 small boxes. There wasn't much written on them, maybe pencil of, the 3 players in the trio. I was skeptical, but when we threw them up, I went over to Ocean Way, which was United by that time, with Bill Smith, who's the kind of head archivist transfer guy there, and we threw up the tapes. And you have to do a little research. You're like, well, okay, what kind of tape is this? What was it recorded mono? Was it recorded stereo? Is it dual mono? Is it 4-track? What is it? And so we spent a lot of time actually working on transferring it as professionally and as carefully as we possibly could, because I definitely looked at it as a really important kind of historical artifact. And when we both heard it coming through the speakers, I was kind of amazed. It was very close and tactile. The piano playing was very forward. There were mistakes, and there was a very live quality to it that you could tell maybe wasn't, they weren't like knowledge. I don't know if they had knowledge that they were being recorded at the time.
I was thinking that too. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Why don't you explain for our audience, where these tapes came from now? What was the process? Of course, the club owner was Frank Holzfind.
Yeah. It's hard to pronounce. It's like my last name. So
we got a lot of tough last names here. But his goal was really to create some recordings for his own personal library, his own personal enjoyment. Yeah. Like he had Nat King Cole there for the week. So he said, well, I'm going to throw up a couple of microphones and just get this for posterity. But what was tell everybody a little bit about what his process was. He wasn't a recording engineer or anything like that, but...
No, it's a fascinating story, because originally it was like, I talked to him, it was like, well, there was a web core machine, which is a, very simple kind of machine of the time that was in his office, not out on the floor, not like a PA, was back in his office.
Right.
And I noticed when I started going through the takes, which I have to explain, it was a lot of material. It was 200 takes, maybe 10 hours of music. I spent maybe a month just categorizing all the takes and which takes had problems and didn't, and they did start and stop in the middle of songs. So I know that there was a sense that he walked back and maybe hit record, and then if he was busy running the venue because he wasn't an engineer or a kind of a producer of any way, he was just doing it for his own personal enjoyment. And I think these tapes were things that the family would listen to. For instance, at Christmas, they would throw on a reel-to-reel machine and kind of listen back to these performances, which is kind of staggering to me that they stayed in relatively good shape over the amount of years. But yeah, I think it's amazing. I think Frank was a huge fan. More importantly, like I later read a lot about him and the fact that he used to run bowling alleys, but it was always like this jazz, kind of massive fan. And this was a passion for him. And I think he had relationships with a lot of these artists. And when he came in, it was kind of natural in his thought line to be like, I got to take a picture of this. I got to preserve a little bit of this, this happening. And so I think that's where these came from. I think it didn't come out of him wanting to release these in a public way or making them, release quality. I think it came out of his just pure love for the art form. And if he could kind of capture that, it was something he could listen to later.
And there's an
So
interesting tidbit from the liner notes and from the package to your point that he had also created in this club, or the whatever version of this club was, it held about 600 people, something like that. And he had a section for teenagers
yeah.
who, weren't going to be buying alcohol. It was an under 21 kind of an area, but he had a little section because he knew that they might want to see these artists, but they couldn't go the way that the adults were going. So he, really wanted to share this music with a large variety of people in the area.
Yeah, I mean, one of the greatest thing, I mean, when I first got the recording, I had to think a lot about how I was going to approach putting it all together. It was a very difficult thing to kind of, what songs are we going to keep? What songs are we not going to keep? How are we going to stick it together? Should it sound live? Should we try to kind of fix it a lot and clean it up a lot? Or should we leave it kind of more raw? And the thing that struck me the most about listening to it was the fan reaction, was the kind of background noise, the talk between sets, him talking through solos and talking to people while he's playing an intro, the banter and the kind of audience participation really made me feel like, what it's like to go to a really cool jazz club and watch a show and feel like you're part of the show, not just that you're the audience, but because you're so close that you kind of become part of it. Like when you go to New Orleans and you sit there in a bar and people walk around and, there's an interaction to it. And so I really wanted to be careful of making sure that was preserved, that you felt like you were going out and you felt like you were watching the show. Because to me, that was the big ticket, was like, wow, if I could go back to that time period and see, if I could go sit and see Miles Davis play, or if I could go see John Coltrane play, or, or the Beatles play in the Cavern, or, just these moments in history where you're really getting a precise view of that artist at that time, that felt like the important thing to me. And so I tried to keep things raw. I tried to keep solos forward. There was a lot of extended arrangements that he played. And one of the fascinating things was listening to him play a song maybe 7 or 8 times in a week. He played it this night, part of this, and he played it later, and they switched the order around of what they played with. And sometimes they would start with this song, or I wouldn't get that song because it got chopped off. And then you could kind of see the evolution of how the week went and which songs worked and which songs didn't, and how they would play these songs more and maybe get rid of these few, and how the arrangements changed. Sometimes they would play it, sometimes it'd just be going well, and he'd just play an extended solo for maybe 16, 24 bars more than he played the night before. So going through the takes and kind of seeing that discovery in real time lent a lot of information to how I was going to put it all together and make it feel like a real event.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned his piano playing. Of course, it really is a showcase on this record, and as you said, most people know Nat King Cole as this vocalist, and that's really what he's well known for. But he not only was he a great piano player, he was an incredible piano player. And listening to these recordings, and I'm always championing his piano playing because it's very exciting to me that he had this sort of secret talent that people didn't really know too much about, but you really get it on this, and I'm glad you also use the word raw, because it does sound really raw. You get a real feel for his style. It was forward, it was up front, it was really aggressive. And again, we think of Nat King Cole as this singing these ballads and being a vocalist, but here he is, this really aggressive piano player too, and I think it's definitely captured here on the recording.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think you're correct. I think there are moments where you can tell magical things happen. There's one moment where the crowd starts singing and he just stops singing and lets them sing, and then he talks to them about how they're singing. And there's a couple other moments where people are yelling out songs or being aggressive with him, and he's kind of aggressive back. And there's a lot of story interplay. And I always think, I mean, vinyl especially is such an amazing medium for this record because it allows for a lot of context. You know what I mean? Like the liner notes, which I think Iconic just did an unbelievable job of putting together a lot of packaging that lets you understand the event. And the story is everything, right? The story is kind of what makes it exciting. And I do think his piano playing is one of the kind of surprises and the highlights of the record. I had several people who are not that familiar with him go, well, who's playing piano?
Right.
A lot of people have come to me and gone, who's on piano? Is that so-and-so? And I'm like, no, that's Nat. And they're like, they kind of give you this look like you're messing with me. And then you go, no, like, and people who know it's him because he has a lot of, working through the records, he has a lot of very specific kind of cadences and cascades and kind of intervals that he plays. So the musical people can kind of pick that out and they know it's him. But I mean, it's an amazing snapshot of that. And I'm so happy that we have it because it really is him having fun. Like you can tell in these takes that he's just having a blast. And sometimes he'll miss a chord and sometimes he'll timing will get a little off or things like that. But generally, I'm shocked at how in tune his vocals are. I didn't do anything to fix anything like that. And how tight the band is. There's several instances where I'm listening and he'll say one word. Most songs have a one-word name that signals that that's what they're going to play. And sometimes it's not the title of the song. He'll say moon, and that will mean paper moon. But within a few seconds of him saying that word, they're all on it, and they are extremely tight. And he hasn't played with a drummer that much at this period. That's a little bit of a new thing. And I think that added a kind of a rhythm element that made it a little more aggressive, I'm going to say. But yeah, I love it. I think the piano playing is like, I had to highlight these songs, and there's a few up front that have, in fact, the first song on the record has this really extended piano solo that when I heard it, and that take is actually a little distorted because it's so aggressive. And I was worried from an audiophile perspective that I was like, wow, this really gets crunchy, because if they get aggressive, there's nobody there at the engineering console to turn down a mic pre or bring down a level. So how it's set is how it sets. And if they're doing a ballad and then an aggressive song, that aggressive song can be a little distorted because of the saturation of the tape. But I just feel the performance outweighs any kind of issues there were with, any of those things. It's just too exciting not to have those and to put them up front, honestly.
Right. Well, as you say, he had a trio with him. They were a quartet together. It was Nat on vocals and piano, John Collins on guitar, Charlie Harris on bass, and Lee Young on drums. So back to the way that these concerts were recorded, 2 microphones, all going unmanned, mixing, just going directly into the recorder. And so this is what you had to sort of play with. You're the engineer here. So how did you sort of balance? I mean, what were you really able to do to, you really had to capture everything as a holistic experience because you only had these 2 channels to tinker with. But what were you able to do to maybe bring out some of those guitar solos or keep that bass from getting too muffled or muffling everything else and highlighting some of those percussive, because you mentioned he does have drums on here, but they were also playing some percussion, which was really cool, some congas or something. But how were you able to sort of do that before the mastering process? The record was mastered by Stephen Marsh at Marsh Mastering, and the tape transfers were done by Bill Smith at United Archiving, and of course the lacquers for the vinyl were cut by Kevin Gray. So how did you sort of juggle what you had? How did you make it the best that you could make it and represent the event as much as you could?
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing is the first part of your question is we're really in speculation land. I don't know how many microphones were set up. I'm assuming there were two, and I'm willing to believe that at the time period they were two ribbon microphones. So I think there was a ribbon microphone that was over the piano, and I can tell because there's a sway arm or a rattle of an arm when he's going to play a solo or does an intro that I can hear in a lot of the recordings that I worked on very hard to work around. So he would say, you know, this is going to be this song and I'll play it. And then you'd hear this like, you know, like he'd grab a bar and move it into where it was in front of him. And then he would start playing. And if there was a solo, sometimes he would grab that microphone and move it out of the way to kind of have more ease at the piano. That let me know that microphone was there and that was capturing his vocal on the piano. And I believe there was another microphone that was pointed toward the trio. Now, I can tell from the recordings that sometimes that microphone wasn't in the same position because sometimes the level of the band versus the level of the piano are different. And I didn't have those microphones separated. They were mono. So it was a dual mono recording. At first, I thought maybe it was stereo, but it was the azimuth of the machine that it was being recorded on, which was the last. So we spent a lot of time trying to get that right. And then we could realize that they would phase cancel and you know, that it was a dual mono recording. So in pictures of the venue, I got way too into this. There was one large kind of loudspeaker that was over the stage. Is a huge box speaker that sat above. And my theory is, and this is only speculation, is that those two mics would come to some sort of mixing console and go to that one mono PA over the stage so that they could, you know, amplify the vocal mostly. That's all I had. So a lot of it had to do with picking takes. A lot of it had to do with let's say we had 7 or 8 takes of, you know, Route 66 or a song like that, and going, okay, this one's good, but this one sounds better. Is the sound better more important than the performance on that one? So you're doing a lot of deciding on whether this take is more audiophile or whether it's as exciting maybe as another take where the mics might not be in the same position.
Right.
And you're talking about a whole week and several shows. So, you know, people are walking on stage, they're moving microphones, they're turning on the machine the next day. It's just different. There's just different takes that sound really different. And so it was a lot of that. And then it was, once I had made the kind of decisions on what takes we felt were the best and gave the best performance of that song, it was about using a little bit of EQ and compression sectionally. So, for instance, if he's going to play a solo and I really want to try to make that solo, the piano of that solo kind of come forward a little bit, I'm EQing that a little differently than the rest of the song so that we can kind of boost the frequencies that the piano lives in without having let's say, the low end of the bass come up a lot. Right. So adjusting levels and adjusting EQs and a little bit of compression to kind of smooth out those transitions from the live performance were the kind of the tools I had. And, you know, and there's editing involved in trying to figure out, like, sometimes it'll be a really good take, but, you know, there'd be a problem with one chord in the intro, or, you know, is there a way I can get, you know, this introduction into this song, and how do I crossfade from that song that we just left into this one? And I tried to get an idea of his specific set list that he did every night, because it changed every show. But I tried to, for instance, Route 66 ends the record. Right. That was the song that he ended his set with more than any other. So I wanted that to be at the end. And other songs that came at the beginning of his set, I wanted those to be at the beginning of the set. And then there's one section that happened, I think, on the 5th night, that was 5 different songs all about love. And he started talking about the fact that the songs were about love in between the takes. And I was like, wow, okay, I might have a little bit of a better version of that song, but I really want this chunk of songs all to stay together, because it's because it's rare, because he got into this vibe of, you know what, let's do that song. And there were people yelling those songs at him. So he kind of got on this tangent of love and had fun with it. And that, once again, that's what was important to me, was that it felt like the actual event, that I wasn't trying to manipulate it in a way to, make it cleaned up and sanitized for, consumption. I wanted it to feel like it was just, like you were there and this was all happening in real time.
That was the night, right?
Yeah.
And back to his dialogue with the audience, he sounds so great. He reminded me of a DJ or a radio announcer or something, which he did have a radio show, but he had that whole, all right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, it was just, it's really fun to hear him do that too. And as you said, the crowd was great, and they were, there were, you could tell there were different crowds. And I think if you listen to the record, you placed the recordings in a way that it seemed like everything was getting wilder and wilder, throughout the end of the show. Everybody was letting their hair down by the end of the show. So, and he was calling back with them, but I really loved his delivery as almost a radio announcer. He sounded great.
Yeah, his charisma and his wit. I mean, he's very quick and very clever, even in just discussing things and talking about, you can come back tomorrow night if you want. He's very elegant in his delivery of funny things. Like, you could tell his stage presence, he just had it. He's just like, he's entertaining to listen to. Even if he was just telling a story, he's very entertaining. There were a lot of pieces that just blew me away, where he'd be having a conversation while he was introducing a song, and I can hear him off mic a little bit talking to somebody, like, we're going to do that. Yeah, hold on one second. And then he'd come back to the mic. I mean, it's very kind of you to say. It was definitely my intention to make sure that felt that way, that it felt like there was an arc. And there were moments where I felt like, wow, is it getting too slow? Like I wanted, like Sweet Lorraine is one of my favorite songs on the record. And part of it is the audio quality and just how it came out. And it has this piano solo that's like really delicate, like where he's playing so different than he is playing on other songs. And the intimacy of the vocal is just striking to me. But those moments were so different from other songs in the show. And I toured for a long time playing. I went out on the road, with Jane's Addiction and Perry Farrell for a while. And you realize that, certain nights are just magical and certain nights aren't. Sometimes you come in and you play a show and the crowd's kind of, there isn't this spark that happens. So I was very conscious of trying to figure out those spots where things did feel a little electric, even if it was more personal, even if it was like Calypso Blues, which is a very stripped down spoken conversation. And there's no music in that track. He doesn't really play piano. There's no bass, there's no guitar. It's just him and percussion. So he's got to find a key and stick with it. And they take off, and then they hope they keep that key and land that tempo through the track. That was a great take because of the way he delivered kind of the jokes of it, and whether the audience got the jokes. Because sometimes he would say that same thing and the audience would just be like, oh, okay, that's cool. And other times they'd just be like, oh my God, you know what I mean? It's that back and forth, I think, that really sparked a lot of the decisions on what songs and what takes to stick together. And you could feel that in going through, all the kind of, I had a huge spreadsheet where I had like all the songs together, pages and pages of spreadsheets. And I remember when I edited it all together, I invited, Jimmy Edwards, the president of the company, and a couple other people to the studio. I gave them a spreadsheet to write notes. If you hear something you don't like, if this doesn't fit with that, like, I want feedback. And they sat there, and it's long, it's a lot of music. And everybody just sat here and just enjoyed it. Like, they got to the end of it and they were just like, well, that was great. And I was like, okay, what notes do you have? Because I was so, focused in. Sure. And they were way more driven by the fact that it just felt good. And I think that was really good for me to just have me kind of back up and make sure that that as a producer that you're looking, and producer's a weird term on this because I'm really trying to edit it and kind of just make sure it lands right.
Right.
And to be really respectful of what I feel like if he was here, he would want. I've worked with a lot of really big musicians in my life. I've been very fortunate, and I'm always like really trying to figure out like, okay, what if he was here, would that be something he would do, or would that not, or would he be like, don't mess with that,
right.
So most of my decisions were taken from that perspective, and just making sure it felt good and that I felt like I could put this on and have a conversation about it and just feel good all night,
Right. Nat was on your shoulder going, James, don't do that. Don't do that, James.
Yeah, there were a lot of decisions to make, and I did feel a little bit by myself in making those. So
right.
I'm constantly asking myself, what would he do? What would he be comfortable with? Would he want me to change that or not change that? Or, this take really has something to say, but it's a little crazy. Is that cool? Are we going to be daring and use that take? Or are we going to be more conservative and use a take that might be more polite? I kind of tried to showcase the event. I wanted it to be like, that's what it was. This is what happened. Right. There you go.
That's a cool approach. I think it's a cool approach. So back to those tapes. You said they were in pretty good shape when you got them.
They were.
And what did you do? Now explain to everybody because our audience would really appreciate it. What kind of tape did you have, and what speed was it, and all that stuff?
Yeah, it was Scotch tape, and it was 7.5 IPS, inches per second. And it was acetate. Which was fascinating to me because normally I'm dealing with a different material, and you're dealing with baking, and you're dealing with shedding and other issues that come from tapes of this era. But they were in remarkably good condition. It took a while to just make sure we understood how it was recorded and setting up the machine correctly to play it back correctly. And then, just making sure that was the most, the cleanest way to get it from one medium to the other. So, it's quarter-inch tape. Yeah.
And so how did you do the actual digital transfer? What was that from the tape?
It went straight. This would be a good question for Bill. I was there. I'm trying to remember exactly what we did. I think it was an ATR machine, which is kind of the gold standard. And we went straight over at 192. And I think I did a version at 96 as well, just because I wanted to hear both. Not that there's a huge difference, but just for preservation reasons, I kind of wanted to make sure it was captured. And yeah, it was, I always feel in that kind of situation, the least amount of fiddling in the actual transfer is the most important part.
Right.
So don't try to overcool it. Do a lot of research about the tape to understand what it was recorded on, and making sure the machine is calibrated and set up as correctly as possible. It's not like we got a set of tones on this tape, which is normally where you kind of would start. If you were doing this in the 70s or 80s, you get a list of tones, and then you would calibrate your machine with those tones. This wasn't that type of situation, but making sure that the machine is set up as perfectly as possible, making sure that everything's as clean as possible, and making sure there's the least amount of anything in between your send and your capture, and that's it.
Right. So Bill Smith did the actual transfer, and I guess the master. He did the master.
He did the transfer. The transfer came to me. I started putting it all together, and then Stefan Marsh did the mastering. At Marsh Mastering. I've worked with Stefan on tons of records. He's kind of he's got a lathe and a lathe room as well. He's a guy that's very aware of technologies and kind of very sensitive to these type of recordings, and he's done a lot of historical recordings kind of like this. So and he's here in town, and that was one of the things that was important to me. A lot of times when you're doing mastering nowadays, it used to be back in the day, you would go and sit with the mastering engineer and you would master a record. But nowadays, most mastering engineers are around the country, and you kind of send them your files, and it's just a digital file, and it goes, they do it. I really wanted to go with him and sit with him and talk through different takes and make sure that he understood, because it's a lot of material, and you have to understand that takes really sounded different. So if I'm putting a take of, let's say, night 2 next to a take that's from night 5, I want to be cautious of what I hear, because he has very expensive equalization and mastering gear that I don't have here. And I trust his ears, and it was also great just to have an outside perspective, and he's a friend, so he could yell at me about something. I wouldn't be upset about it, which I like. And I was just trying to make sure that some tracks in the recording may have been hotter or had more piano or more bass in them than another track. So I was trying to make sure that I could kind of smooth out those edges and help with that EQ a little bit track to track. If this was a record that I had produced and I had tracked, then I wouldn't have to worry about that, because I would have been in the studio and using this console, and I would be conscious of that through the whole recording process. But because this was done in maybe a week apart and the mics were in a different spot, I may love this take, but it may not sound sonically like the one that I'm crossfading into. So Stefan was really helpful in going like, what can we do to make this take kind of fit that transition as well as possible, and to feel like it's part of that same night. So yeah, that was helpful on his part. And that was, again, I wanted somebody that was here in town so that I could go sit with him and do it in person, instead of trying to send notes back and forth and kind of conversing via email, which can often specific things can get lost in that translation.
Yeah. And so now you've got the record mastered, and was there anything notable about the transfer to vinyl? Of course, you did decide to make this a double disc, and so you have some extra real estate, some extra grooves to work with. But how was that process from mastering to Kevin Gray?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin Gray did an amazing job. I think that his he has a kind of specific thing he does. He's very, kind of private about that transition and how he does it. But it went through a few different iterations because of, when the record was going to come out, and where we could find the best pressing facility and who was going to press it. I mean, all those things, as you, I'm sure, well know by what's behind you, are so, you got to be really careful about who stamps something, listening to references. Are we going to do it here? Are we going to do it there? Who has the material? What gram do we want to do? All those kind of questions become real important. And, there's a team of people at Iconic that had worked on that. We were doing other records at the same time, and we were working with other mastering places and different people who were cutting stuff. So this just seemed like the right fit. And this was done at RTI, I believe, here. And Doran, who did that, and everybody knows each other. There's this kind of interesting small group of people, and they're all aware of each other and know each other. I've sent stuff to him, so it's about communication and making sure everybody knows what's going on in the process. And yeah, it was, we went through a lot. I went through a lot of listening to lacquer and a lot of, test pressings of being like, well, is there a way to get this? And there's something there. It's a very, that medium is so fascinating to me, kind of like analog tape. There's, things happen that you just can't predict. So you got to constantly kind of have an ear to it and be aggressive with what you are trying to capture, but also understand that there are inconsistencies in how that process works that are unavoidable. So you're just trying to get the best possible people and the best possible companies to do that. And it's fascinating to hear the sonic difference, even slight sonic differences between different places and in different mediums. And yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that's a producer. You're wearing a lot of hats. And speaking of those hats, this
Yeah.
is a really cool package. There are a lot of interesting
Yeah.
goodies that came. This was sort of a reproduction of, I guess it was a monthly newsletter that the Blue Note
Yeah.
Chicago must have put out. And it's very lovingly reproduced here. It looks really good. And it gives you here they are talking about Nat being there in August of 1953, and they're talking about, just his background and what you can expect, and there's some other things there too. And of course, you do have, as you mentioned, this is a perfect project for liner notes and information
Yep.
and photographs and context. And there's a great essay here from Will Friedwald, who's a Nat King Cole biographer. And whoops.
Yeah.
And so tell us a little bit about some of these extra things that you managed to include in this record.
Well, I give Iconic just a huge amount of credit for pursuing all this stuff, and I have to give a nod to my wife, Laura, who worked on a lot of this packaging and is kind of the reason why I think in many ways it looks and has the stuff in it that it does.
I have a
She's
wife named Laura too, by the way, James.
There you go. She's my boss. I'm sure yours is your boss.
We
Yes.
both have our Lauras.
There you go. That's the monthly newsletter that you showed there, the first thing. That was fascinating because that was something that came up in the first phone call. Before any of this was started and we thought we were going to do it, there was that phone call with Tom, and he brought up the newsletter, and so smartly, Laura was like, you don't have that newsletter, do you? And he was like, I might. And there was this conversation about, like, is there any way we could get that newsletter and that original mailed? And that's how it's there. So that was, it's like little things like, maybe he had a matchbook, or he had, business cards from the Blue Note at that time. These type of things really add to the story and add to the memorabilia that comes with the packaging, which is, to me, one of the biggest, not the biggest thing, but one of the big things that I love about vinyl is that you get this opportunity to get this touchable information that you can read. It's funny because I was in Chicago when we flew out to do research, and the whole team of us went. And while we were eating lunch, I ran next door into a record store, and I just started looking through Nat King Cole bins, and I found a bunch of old recordings of Nat King Cole. One of them, it's in the back of the room here, was a trio, but it had like a threefold, and it had a pamphlet with pictures and all sorts of stuff in it. And I was like, this is so cool. Like, this is really a lot of information that was in this that, we don't get from, poking something on Spotify. So I think that was an initial thought, and to make sure that we got that information kind of in there. And she was very careful. Laura was very careful in kind of tracking the stuff down and collecting it for the packaging. I think she just did an unbelievable job. And, that the liner notes in there about the recording were fascinating to me, because obviously when you work on a record and you send it out to people, you don't know what they're going to think, and you don't know what the people that are historians on Nat King Cole are going to appreciate or get or dislike or whatever. And to read that back, honestly, it was extremely emotional for me to read that and hear him talk about Nat King Cole's life and what he felt about the recordings and what he felt about the arrangements of the different parts of the record. And some of it was just stuff I didn't know at all, which was amazing to me. It kind of makes my hair stand up just thinking about, like, he's bringing all his knowledge to something that he's written a biography. He's has all this information, and you're seeing him go, this is really magical. And that makes you feel really good, because the amount of time and energy and, part of yourself that you put into it, feels really validated. So that was pretty impressive.
Yeah, it gives it a good foundation. And of course, just aesthetically, I think if the goal that you had was to create an aesthetic package here that maybe replicated what might have been released in the mid 50s, if this record were to come out back then, if that was your goal, I think you definitely achieved it. You've got a beautiful, I mean, this looks like something that, you know, if I have some old Sinatra records or some Nat King Cole original pressings, this is similar to that. And of course you've added some nice archival audiophile sleeves here. So what was the who did the actual graphic design, maybe packaging, stuff like that? Anything you could share with us about that?
You know, it's really Laura, the iconic team. I mean, there's a team of people. It's like anything. It's not one person that's doing everything, but there's a huge group of people that put in a lot of effort.
Art direction and design by Paul Moore and Alex Tenta.
Yeah, they did a fantastic job, and they put up with a lot, just in kind of being creative. Being creative is tough, and we definitely worked really hard on trying several different things until it felt right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it's great. I mean, it's a really fun package, and it made me start to wonder. So the club owner's son, his name is Tom. I guess he was the person who had these tapes. He had them in the family, I suppose. And when I'm reading about this, I'm thinking to myself, oh, there must be many more tapes out there in the archives that
I feel you.
Dad probably recorded, right?
Yeah, and it was fascinating because there were many talks about, like, you know, well, okay, who else did you hit the red button on in this? You know, Duke Ellington was playing there, and you know, all these people were playing there. So yeah, it's a bit of a well. I can't speak to the specifics of what's on that shelf, but it is tantalizing to think about. And I'm really grateful that these were found, and that the time and kind of effort was put in to kind of bring them to light in the most professional way that we could possibly do. And they did really give, you know, they did really give us full reign. Iconic really was like, how can we make this as cool as we can? And that doesn't always happen, as you know, and you're always like, well, we can do this, but you know, let's not go too far on that. Right. They really cared about it, and because I think they work with these artists, and you know, there's a kind of there's a family contingent, I think, that's involved. So we're all kind of trying to make sure we put our best foot forward and really put in the extra effort to make sure that these artists get represented in a way that we feel comfortable with, which is, you know, why it was so great to go to Chicago. I really felt Chicago in these recordings, and I really felt that the information and the people that we spoke to, I mean, I remember going to Nat King Cole Park, which is there in Chicago, and just walking around his park and, you know, seeing a little plaque and talking to people from the city about what they were doing and how they were getting kids in the park. And, you know, you get this sense of the reality of the situation. It's not just something you're reading in a book. It's something you're feeling as a city. And they take it very seriously. And so, you know, that's imparted on you, and you feel like it's your job to make sure that that's represented as well. And it's funny because in meetings, sometimes we would talk about stuff for a long time. And at the time that we went to Chicago, I had some of the recordings in a very rough mixed format on my laptop. And we'd be having a conversation and talking about Nat King Cole, and everybody would be kind of, you know, like you do in a meeting. And then I'd be like, well, you know, like, I have this song, and I would just hit the space bar and it would play, and he would play a song, and it would just change the room completely. Like the discussion would immediately shift into this, like, you know, everybody would kind of lean in, and then you would get this emotional connection with the artist. And I think that's everything that we do, everything that we're trying to talk about. It's the reason I'm here talking to you, is to try to get more people to have that creative connection with the art form. And if we can do that, then it just grows and it gets bigger and more people appreciate it. And that just feels great to me. So, yeah, it's interesting to see when it happens, and you just kind of, and then people come to you after, hey, is there any way I can get a copy of that? And there's, you know, and there's this, you know, this kind of rollover into them really understanding where it's coming from.
Right. Well, James, congratulations on
Thank
producing
you.
this record, and wish you the best of luck with it. And happy Record Store Day! It's coming out for Record Store
Yeah,
Day, so it's coming out soon, and I hope it's successful for you. And thanks for the hard work that you put into it.
and I really appreciate it. It's very kind of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's much fun to do.